Hi, I'm just going to turn this off. I hope you turn yours off. I'm Paul Woodruff. I'm the outgoing Dean of Undergraduate Studies, and I want to welcome you to this magnificent theater, which I hope you will visit many times during the time you're at the university. This is one of our great assets. And I also want to welcome you to the first of our university lectures this year. This is designed to give students in the signature course something to talk about across the courses, an exciting intellectual event. This particular event, I think, raises a number of possibilities for you. We say at the University of Texas that we don't change the world, we change people, and they change the world. And half of that is false. I'm sorry to tell you. We don't change people. I've been teaching 39 years, and I don't think I've changed anyone. But I've seen many students change themselves, and that's a very exciting thing to watch. One of the great ways you can change yourself is to get involved in research. Now, you may have thought, as many of our students think, that research is something that you do in a laboratory wearing a mask with rubber gloves and chemicals bubbling all around you. That's not exactly the case. You're going to meet 3 different teams of researchers tonight, and they do very different kinds of research. One of them is indeed using a lab, and you'll learn a little bit about how that works. The others are doing something quite different. What you may not know also is that this university has research opportunities for first-year students. You can become involved in research. You are very fortunate to be students at one of the top research universities in the world. We're very highly ranked in research. And you may ask, what does that do to me? I didn't come for research. I came, well, I don't know what you came for. This is also known as a party school. And that's false, right? 6th Street is way too far away. And so is West Campus, so I won't say anything more about that. But there is an enormous value to you in your being at a research university, and I hope that before the night is over, you have some idea why that's true. Now, after you've heard the 3 teams present, we're going to have some question and answer from our student panel, which I'll introduce when the time comes. And I'm also going to ask you to indicate through your applause which program of research you think is going to have the greatest effect in changing the world. So pay attention, be ready to applaud, and have a good time tonight. Now I'm going to, great, okay. I'm going to introduce the first team, Professor Juan Dominguez and his student. They are going to tell you something about the brain and reproductive behavior, which I think means sex. Is that right? Okay.
Thank you for that introduction, Paul. And my name is Juan Dominguez. I am a behavioral neuroscientist, which means that I am interested in understanding how the brain and chemicals in the brain regulate behaviors and also behavioral disorders. To do this, we employ a variety of techniques, including anatomical experiments, chemical experiments, hormonal experiments, molecular experiments, and yes, of course, also behavioral experiments. Why is this important, you might be asking? Well, we now know that the brain and chemicals in the brain are essential for the expression of all behaviors. And so an understanding, an appreciation of that interaction, that is to say, how the brain and behavior interacts, is essential or required if we're going to understand why it is that we do the things that we do. Next slide, please. Your nervous system is divided into many regions. The two major divisions that comprise your nervous system include the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. Now, the central nervous system is then also further subdivided into the spinal cord and the brain. And I've included this picture of a human brain. In fact, this is technically called a mid-sagittal view of the brain, to help me illustrate the large number of structures present in your brain. In fact, this is only a very small sample of the numerous structures present in your brain. If we were to look at your brain, if we were to take an exterior view of your brain, what we would find is that it is divided into many divisions. In fact, specifically 4 major divisions that are called lobes, L-O-B-E-S. For example, you have the frontal lobe, which of course is in the very front of your brain, which is important for a variety of things, including higher cognitive functions. And so, for example, your ability to predict, your ability to forecast the consequences or the outcomes of your behaviors are largely dependent on activity in your frontal lobe, specifically the prefrontal cortex, which is in the frontal lobe. Behind the frontal lobe, which is in the very front of the brain, we have another part called the parietal lobe. And then in the very back, we have the occipital lobe, which also is very important, is important for many things, including the visual system. Your ability to see is dependent, at least in part, on activity in your occipital lobe. Then, immediately behind your temples, you have the 4th lobe, which is called the temporal lobe. It's called the temporal lobe because it sits behind your temples. The temporal lobe is the part of the brain, rather includes a part of the brain that I like to call the gateway to emotions. Why is that? Well, inside the temporal lobe, you have another structure, a smaller structure, called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the gateway to what is termed the limbic system. And the limbic system in your brain is credited with the regulation of emotions. And so your ability to sense happiness, your ability to sense sadness, anger, fear, disgust, is dependent on activity in your limbic system. So, next slide, please. Here at the very top, the two pictures in the bottom are still pictures of the human brain, but on the very top, you have a cartoon depicting what is called a coronal view of the brain, that is to say, looking at the brain from the front. And here, delineated inside the brain in the cartoon, are the structures comprising the limbic system, again, the regions regulating emotions. And you may or may not be able to see that one of these structures is indeed the amygdala, the gateway to this system. But also included here is a region called the hypothalamus, which sits at the very base of your brain. And it is the hypothalamus that we study in my laboratory, in addition to the other limbic regions. And why is that? Next slide, please. The hypothalamus is important for motivated behaviors. Specifically, the hypothalamus is important for parental behavior. That is to say, paternal and maternal behavior is closely regulated by activity in your hypothalamus. Another motivated behavior, feeding behavior, is also dependent on activity in your hypothalamus. So, for example, your ability to detect hunger your ability to detect satiety once you've eaten, is dependent on activity in your hypothalamus. These are what we call naturally rewarding behaviors. The hypothalamus is also important for the regulation of reproductive behaviors. And we know this in part, these are studies that have been performed both in our labs and elsewhere, because if we ablate, if we lesion, if we perform some damage in the hypothalamus, that results in the inhibition or attenuation of reproductive behaviors. Conversely, if we stimulate the hypothalamus, as you would predict, you find an enhancement or a facilitation of reproductive behaviors. We're also interested in my laboratory in understanding or discovering which chemicals, brain chemicals, work in the brain to regulate reproductive behaviors. One of these is a chemical that many of you may have already heard about, is dopamine. For quite some time, we've known that the neurotransmitter, the neurochemical, brain chemical dopamine, facilitated the expression of reproductive behaviors, but we now know that it does this largely by acting where? In the hypothalamus, at the base of the brain. And so in summary, much of the work performed in my lab is dedicated to understanding how the brain and chemicals in the brain regulate behaviors, specifically in this case, reproductive behaviors. More recently, and this is the line of work that's been recently funded by the National Institutes of Health, more recently we've become interested in determining whether drugs of abuse, like cocaine, exert their influences by acting in the same brain regions regulating reproductive behaviors. Moreover, we have also started experiments where we are trying to determine whether what are called sex steroid hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone primarily, whether these hormones that are known to either increase reproductive behaviors or at times decrease reproductive behaviors, depending on which hormone we're talking about, whether these same hormones also increase response to drugs of abuse, or whether they might conversely decrease response to drugs of abuse, depending again on which hormone we're making reference to. And indeed, we're finding that this is the case. The hormones that facilitate, that enhance reproductive behaviors are also enhancing the response to drugs of abuse by acting in the same regions that are responsible for the regulation of reproductive behaviors. And conversely, hormones, sex steroid hormones that inhibit reproductive behaviors are also attenuating the response to drugs of abuse. And so, because what starts here really does change the world, our hope is that in the very near future, our experiments will help in the development of hormone-based treatment or therapy to help alleviate symptoms of addiction. Now, none of this work would be possible without the help of my research team, which includes postdocs, graduate students, technicians, and of course, undergraduate research assistants. And that's students like yourself. One of them is sitting here with me today, Trisha Lalapet. Trisha came to me 2 years ago, and she's been in my lab since. She's been participating and helping in many experiments, and more recently, she is overseeing her own project in line with the sort of thing that I just described for you. And so I know that she's eager to describe some of this for you. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I'd like to introduce Trisha.
Thank you, Dr. Dominguez. Hi, everyone. I'm Trisha. So I'm a third-year senior majoring in microbiology. And as most of you know, UT is a great research institution. So when I joined as a freshman, I was really interested in getting involved in research on campus. So what I did was I went to several lab websites and I looked through their publications and research objectives, and I finally narrowed down my search to something I was interested in, which was Dr. Dominguez's lab. And I contacted him and introduced myself, and he in turn introduced me to his graduate students and other lab members, and I've been there ever since. I've worked on a variety of different lab projects, and the one that I most recently worked on with the help of one of the graduate students was a study to assess the effects of cocaine activity in the hypothalamus of the rat brain. For our study, our rats were under anesthesia, and half of them received a lesion to their brain, meaning that part of their brain was removed. The other half received a sham lesion, meaning that they went through a similar surgery, but their brains remained intact. Half of the rats in each of the groups received a cocaine injection, and the other half received a vehicle injection. A vehicle injection is simply one that has a saline solution but no drug in it. So after that, the animals were sacrificed, their brains were collected, and the tissue was analyzed using an immunohistochemistry procedure, which allowed us to visualize certain proteins that would indicate specific brain activity in the hypothalamus. After analysis, our data did support the idea that the hypothalamus plays a key role in the motivation and reward system pathways in the brain. So that's just a little bit about the research that I've gotten to work on, and I hope that if any of you are interested in research, you'll take full advantage of all your opportunities here at UT, because it will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Tricia, and thank you, Professor Dominguez. Our next team is Professor Zachary Elkins from the Government Department and his student, whom he'll introduce.
Thank you, Professor Woodruff. Well, you just heard about some research about sex. After me, you're going to hear about some research on drugs. And I am going to talk to you about constitutions. Thank you. But it is apropos in some ways. As some of you might know, today is a national holiday. Does anybody know what today's holiday is? Yeah. It is National Constitution Day. Yeah. Not many people know that. I work on constitutions, and I actually wasn't quite aware of it. It ranks, I think, in the hierarchy of holidays somewhere between Arbor Day and Flag Day. But it is important. I've been working on constitutions for about 15 years, and I primarily work on the historical evolution of constitutional ideas. I look at questions having to do with the effects of constitutions. I look at questions having to do with the conceptualization and taxonomy of constitutions. I also do some work with constitutional drafters, trying to provide some of the insights from our research to people actually writing constitutions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to ask John Marsh to come up, and he's going to tell you about a project we've been working on to do exactly that, to actually connect with constitutional drafters and share some of the insights of our research. So the next slide, please. I think people have the sense that constitutions are important. This is a portrait that was commissioned by the Mexican government after the publication of the 1857 Constitution. And, you know, it gives you a sense of the degree to which countries revere their constitutions. We certainly do that here. There's no doubt about it. This is, after all, Constitution Day. But constitutions, when you actually start reading them and looking at them, they really vary. They vary by their content, of course, and we've got a very short, sort of, sometimes kind of call it a framework constitution, just a set of principles. Other constitutions are really detailed. The Swedish Constitution has a whole section on reindeer herding. The Brazilian Constitution has a whole section on sports. 5 pages, actually, on sports. It's amazing. And the first minister of sports there was Pelé. It's a really interesting constitution. They also differ, constitutions do, by how much they matter. Some of you may have heard the old Soviet joke from the 50s about the Soviet Constitution. It goes like this, that the Soviet Constitution has the freedom of speech, whereas the American Constitution has the freedom after speech. No groans, you gotta really take what you get in terms of constitutional humor. I mean, these jokes are few and far between in this business. But the point is that there's a large variance in the degree to which there's actual compliance to these rules. Another way the constitutions vary is really how long they last. There's a big difference in their endurance. This 1857 Constitution only lasted about 60 years, but more on that later. What I've been doing to address these questions is to build a large data set, basically recording the content of constitutions that have existed for the last 200 years across pretty much every country. And with that data, try to get a sense of what the origins are of certain constitutional ideas, what the effects are of some constitutional ideas, and also to provide some of that data for drafters. This is a project, you know, really in some ways is built out of whole cloth. The last person to do this kind of thing was Aristotle, who, as you may know, did something similar with respect to the city-states in ancient Greece. And so in some ways it's kind of nice. If you, normal political science research, you see people introducing the intellectual precedents of their work saying, oh, Professor Jones of Michigan State has an article in the Political Science Journal of blah, 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 blah. And it's kind of nice to say, following up on Aristotle's work, here's what we're, anyway, big shoes to fill, but we're trying to do it. I'll give you a sense of some of the questions we're asking, what our answers are. First, I want to talk about endurance a little bit. I mentioned this Mexican Constitution of 1857. It had a nice run, about 60 years. It was replaced by the 1917 Constitution, but yeah, it's about 60 years. It's not bad. The US Constitution, of course, has been going on for a couple centuries, very stable, but that's not at all par for the course. You look around, you see a lot more instability. The French Constitution, for example, tends to be rewritten almost 20 years, every 20 years or so. There's an old joke, let me share another constitutional joke, about the French Constitution. The guy walks into the library, asks for a copy of the French Constitution, only to be told by the librarian that, sorry, we don't stock periodicals. You gotta take what you can get, I'm telling you, all right. So anyway, so the point is not very long lasting, but it's not even, you know, every 30 years, that's not so bad actually when you look at some of the other countries. In Latin America, there's some countries that have had 25 or 30 constitutions. The Dominican Republic and Haiti, two countries that share the island of Hispaniola, have each had about 30 constitutions each. So in fact, the island of Hispaniola is responsible for about 1/10 of the world's constitutions. It really is the most fertile area for constitutional design. If you're thinking about research down in the Caribbean, something to think about. So there is a lot of variance in how long these things last. And let me just share with you some insights from the research that we've done on this. Two kind of strange coincidences, actually. One having to do with the average lifespan. So, and I have to give you a little background on this. There's an old debate between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in which they went back and forth across this with a series of letters debating this question of whether laws should automatically expire after a certain amount of time. Because Thomas Jefferson had decided that, you know what, all laws, including the Constitution, should just expire after 17 years. He had this idea that, as he said, the dead should not rule the living. And he had gotten this number 17 because he was looking at some actuarial tables, and he determined that half the population would turn over every 17 years or so. So he thought that was a good time. Jefferson, you know, when Jefferson was writing this and sort of presenting this idea to Madison, Jefferson was over in France serving as the American ambassador to France, while James Madison was actually in Philadelphia writing the US Constitution. So you can imagine, you know, Madison wasn't too thrilled about the idea of having his friend Jefferson just sort of rip up his work after 20 years. It turns out, when you actually look at the evidence, and you look at the chronology of constitutional events, that the average life expectancy for a constitution is exactly 17 years. It's really eerie. It's exactly the amount of time that Jefferson thought constitutions should expire. And they do. So that's one eerie insight. Another has to do with what part of the lifespan constitutions are most vulnerable. And what I mean by that is to think about, if you think about the mortality rate of a constitution, it should vary across the lifespan of the Constitution. That is, you might think, perhaps, that the Constitution would be really vulnerable in the beginning, that it would have a high infant mortality rate. But, you know, after people settled in, maybe it would crystallize and really become the law of the land and be something that's kind of irreversible. You might have the other hypothesis. You might think that, you know what, the Constitution will be written, but you know, it will gradually become sort of defunct and wither away. And interestingly enough, you know, constitutions are often compared to marriage. And you know, they're very similar. People coming together to join a union for pretty much perpetuity. And if you look at the hazard rates, the mortality rates for marriages, it's kind of interesting. There is a lot of high infant mortality. In the week after a marriage, it's when you're at most risk of divorce. I mean, theoretically, those are the Vegas unions. And then after about 7 years, there's another high risk of divorce. That's, you know, sort of the proverbial 7-year itch. And then there's another spike in mortality around 20 years after the kids go off to college. And it's interestingly enough, constitutions have the exact same mortality pattern. That is, there's a lot of high infant mortality. Around 7, there's kind of a spike of deaths. And then again at age 20. It's almost eerie. Okay, so those are the kinds of things, those are kind of strange sort of descriptive facts we've been looking at, but there are all sorts of questions having to do with how long constitutions last, and what their effects are and their origins. I want to say one thing about plagiarism, which is kind of interesting. If you look at constitutions, you find that they're strangely similar across countries. And there's no surprise. I mean, if you think about the people writing them, usually it's 3 o'clock in the morning and the drafter has been commissioned to give the subcommittee a section on rights or something. And of course, like everybody else, he's procrastinated. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, say they're in Bolivia, he's kind of looking at the Argentine Constitution and saying, you know what, that section on right looks pretty good. Copy, paste. I mean, there's a lot of that going on. If you look at constitutions, even the typographical errors are reproduced across constitutions. It's eerie. And so obviously we know what's happening. We know that people don't want to sit down and write these things. They're really hard-pressed. What we want to do, and a lot of this is what I study when I look at the origins of these constitutions and which ones spread from country to country. It's interesting to see the patterns. But what we want to do, John and I do, in our work, is to see if we can actually give these designers a more systematic way to look across countries. And so we've built, next slide please, I'll let John explain some of this, a website. This has been up for about 6 or 7 years, and a lot of constitutional designers use this. And it actually has some resources that shares some of our data and some of our reports, and actually a pretty good blog on these things. And John has been helping me develop a feature which is really quite interesting. We have all these documents and all these texts, and theoretically they're searchable and constitutional designers can look at them, but there's no really easy way to sort and search for particular provisions. Say you want text on the right to privacy or something. And so we've been building a search engine that really grabs the text for very particular provisions and allows them to sort by, say, geographical area or by era, whatever subset of constitutions might be relevant to the drafter. So I'll let John explain to that. Just by way of introduction, I'll say that John Marsh is really one of the best undergraduates I've had. He was in my constitutional design class last spring and was a standout there. He's kind of interesting in the extent that he took off from school, has a tech background. And so for this particular project, it really takes some of the research and integrates technology in kind of an interesting way. John was a perfect fit. And I'll let him describe some of his experience. Thanks.
So about 9 months ago, I came to UT as an undergraduate, and like a lot of you here, I never imagined that I'd be doing research that affects countries all over the world. And now, oddly enough, I didn't pick my major based on, you know, I wanted to get into this field. I actually picked my major when it came time to fill out my UT application form, and there was that drop-down box that was really long, and I had no idea what to pick, and I spent about an hour scrolling through that, and finally picked something. I mean, you know, who here, show of hands, has also struggled with choosing their major? Yeah, I mean, there's tons of you. At any rate, you know, I decided it would be best to take a wide variety of courses, regardless of my major. You know, I wanted to find something that piqued my interest, and I didn't want to be pigeonholed into something that, you know, was only specific for my major. And one of those classes was obviously taught by Dr. Elkins, and it all really started with me having a genuine interest in his course's content. And I feel that getting to know your professors that are, one, you find interesting, and two, that you're interested or you want to find more about what they're all about, that's really what's essential in figuring out what you're going to do here at UT. So my responsibilities here. On this project, they varied. I did some brainstorming with some ideas about how we should take the direction and what methodology we should take for the project, how we should implement, whether or not we should implement some framework software, or and what type of XML programs we should use. I had to do some ad hoc testing with that. I created some wireframe mock-ups, if you'll advance the next slide, actually, things like this I had to create, and we use these to request in our NSF grant requests for money. And so finally, I participated in all the planning meetings as well with a group of collaborators, both at Stanford and here locally with a group of computer scientists. And also a few meetings with the internal LA IT team. But all in all, being a research assistant is way more flexible than a part-time job or an internship, because the work you do is a lot more project-based. So it's not about coming into work at a specific time and clocking in, clocking out, and all that business. Research is more about having the self-discipline to completing tasks on your own. It's about having personal responsibility to complete the work you do without having someone looking over, your boss looking over your shoulder, or being babysat on what to do. And what I feel is most important, it helps with time management, which is a very valuable skill when you're in college. I mean, at least for me, the more time I have for sleep and beer, the better. But seriously, I hope many of you walk away tonight with a new goal, which is pursuing research at UT. It's an extremely valuable skill to have, and it's a great bragging point in future interviews. But the first step is right here. It's taking this opportunity to get involved with a project and with a professor. Even if you're undecided or undeclared, as I was in my first year, take a variety of classes, even ones you don't think you'd be interested in. I guarantee one of those will at least catch your attention. And I know you hear like world-changing research is kind of a dizzying task, but I feel that you can make some change. And you can make some change in a subject that you are really, truly passionate about. Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you, John. And that was a great message. I hope none of you are embarrassed by being undecided or embarrassed by having decided a few months ago, but now realizing that you're not quite so sure. There are many opportunities here, and you can learn more about them while you're here than you could before you arrived. And there are research opportunities all over campus. And as you can see from this example, they don't necessarily take you into a lab. Our next team is led by Professor Lori Holleran Steiker from the School of Social Work.
Thanks very much. So I'm a clinical social worker by training and by profession. And as a social worker, our research is what we call applied research. Biopsychosocial spiritual is the model that we model ourselves on in terms of holistic implications for research. So when I first came upon drug and alcohol prevention, I was a clinician working with, a therapist working with adolescent substance abusers. And I didn't think much of drug and alcohol prevention, to be very honest. I thought pretty much that it was an oxymoron. And I had this instinct that young people were either going to use drugs or not use drugs based on their life experience, based on their who they were as a person, perhaps genetics mixed in, but I didn't really think that we could have much impact on that. Well, as a doctoral student, I got to work with a mentor named Flavia Marsilia at Arizona State University, who was working on culturally grounded drug prevention programming. And Dr. Marsilia believed in what he called bottom-up research instead of top-down research. Let me explain what that is. Most research, as we've kind of picked up on, is done by professors at universities like ours all across the nation and the world. And such research, we find out what works, and then we translate it to everyday life, and we implement it, which is important and very critical to doing things that work. We can't shoot from the hip. We have to have evidence-based practice for our work. However, it's really, really important that that work resonate with the people that are receiving it. A lot of our work is created in, the expression is ivory towers. I like to use that expression because we have a quite literal ivory tower. I'm reminded that it's burnt orange on occasion, but it's an ivory tower. And so the work that we do has to affect those that receive it. So what Dr. Marsilia's team, and when I was a doctoral student, what we decided we needed to do was we needed to get the information from young people. So what we did was we did research by gathering information from high school students, and we asked them, what are the popular drugs of choice? Who do drug offers come from? What do those drug offers look like? How do you say no when you want to say no? And next slide. This is the program we came up with. We called it Keeping It Real, and we learned that just say no wasn't enough. They said drug offers are coming from our best friends, our brothers, our sisters, our cousins, our boyfriends, and sometimes our parents. And we're not going to offend them by putting our hand up and walking away. And so the other techniques that we use is we explain our drug use, or our desire not to use drugs, and we say, I'm going out for the soccer team and they're popping drug tests and I don't want to come up dirty. I want to go out for soccer. And a friend says, oh, okay, cool, man. What I'm also finding out from students here in Austin is that more commonly than peer pressure, we have a lot of students whose response would be, okay, more for me. So actually, it's the peer pressure isn't as common as it used to be. Avoid is the situation where you just make a decision that I'm not going to go to parties if I know that there's going to be a certain substance like cocaine that you're not interested in using. And leave is if I see a certain substance, I'm going to leave with or without explanation. So we created this drug prevention program, which was culturally grounded and very strong in terms of not just information only, like the DARE program. How many of you had the DARE program? How about Shattered Dreams? Okay, so these are the most highly disseminated drug prevention programs. And guess what? The first evaluations of the DARE program showed increase in pot smoking. Hard to believe, right? Well, it's not hard to believe. You know what my DARE program looked like? It's policemen passing around a bag of pot saying, this is what you're not supposed to use. And they've improved since then, and we're not going to diss the DARE program because they have made improvements since then. Shattered Dreams, very powerful stuff, very emotional stuff, yes? Big, dramatic car crash, an ambulance, and sometimes a funeral. It's people crying and sobbing up on stage, and oh, my best friend died, and horrible, horrible. And one of my students told me most recently that it's a very successful program if the goal is increasing the guilt when you drink and drive the following weekend. We don't have evidence that shows it's effective, but there is a science of prevention, and there are things that we can do, and they're driven by culturally adapting programs to the messages that are effective with the young people that we're serving. And it comes down to the fact that the young people that we are serving are the experts in their life experience. Now, adolescents aren't used to being experts in anything as far as adults are concerned. But let's go to the next slide. When we decided to have them do adaptations of the Keeping It Real program by rewriting the scenarios and remaking the videos in that program, they took the wording and sometimes changed it. The original curriculum said you're walking home from school when you see a group of students who you know are known for using marijuana, and they said we don't talk like that. So they changed it to you're chilling under the bridge with some peeps who smoke dope. That's more realistic, yes? Okay. My favorite change that they made was at the YMCA low-income housing after-school program. The original curriculum says, I feel blank at the school dance. They said, we don't go to school dances. I said, what do you want it to say? They said, we feel blank at the club with a bottle full of bub. I said, 50 cent. 50 cent! I knew it was 50 cent. They were like, woohoo, she's so good. I was like, you got to have that if you work with adolescents. We put that in the workbook, and that spurred some of the best conversations that those young people had had about drug and alcohol prevention that we had ever had. And you know what? As a professor and as a researcher, I wouldn't have thought of it. I wouldn't have thought of it. That was their idea. Okay, so we put all that stuff in there, and their consequences, they told us what their consequences were. And you know what the serendipitous finding of the study was? Do you know what that means? That means a surprise finding. The one that I'm now writing up as a grant to resubmit to NIH to get funding for. We found that the kids who helped us do the adaptation, the ones who changed the scenarios and the videos, they said, we went home and you ruined our high. They said, knowing all this prevention stuff and talking about the consequences and the impact that it had on our younger brothers and sisters and cousins, and we couldn't use in the same way. I think it's an intervention. So it kills two birds with one stone, right? Improves your curriculum, because my NIH grant showed that it did improve the outcomes to culturally ground it, but it also intervenes with the kids that are getting high. Son of a gun, having reality-based conversations about drugs and alcohol changes kids' behavior. And that's why we're doing this. It started at McNeil High, now we're doing it at Westlake High, an intervention called the dialogue, where kids weigh out, next slide please, the payoffs and the downsides of use. Because any risky decision has a weighing out of payoffs and downsides. Now, this is controversial. Why? Because nobody wants to admit that there's payoffs to drug use. Guess what? Kids use why it feels good. It is an impact on the brain. Dr. Dominguez told us that. We know that to be true. Now, I'm going to wrap up because I'm running out of time. There's a ton of stuff that I'd love to share with you, so you have to take my young people in drugs class. But I'm going to tell you something. Addiction is a piece in this. Addiction is a brain disease. There are some kids who you cannot prevent from using, and if they use, they cannot stop on their own. And so if you want to learn about that, there are a lot of places to do that. Carlton Erickson in our pharmacy department has a great website, so Google it. But I want to introduce you to the real experts. We have students in the front row from the Center for Students in Recovery. They are amazing people who have recognized compulsive behavior and addictions and in their lives and their families' lives, and had made a decision on a college campus to live differently. They blow my mind every single day. They're the real experts. They've done the research. They will tell you that. I'd like to introduce the Center for Students in Recovery, if you guys would stand up and take a look. Woohoo! T-shirts! Woohoo! All right. They've agreed to stay after if anybody wants to talk to them about who they are and what they do. They're absolutely amazing. I'm going to introduce my student now who's associated with the Center for Students in Recovery. She has also worked for the Center for Social Work Research, and she's also a research assistant for my dialogue project when we get started at Westlake High and Alternative School. I give you Kate Villachamp.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Villachamp, and I'm a fourth-year social work major. So during the past summer, I was involved in a research project through the Center for Social Work Research, which the project's aim was to provide mental health services to youth in Texas. So the researchers' goal was to provide youth and family-driven, community-involved, and evidence-based resources that were also effective, affordable, and accessible. So my role in the research project was to aid in the facilitation of focus groups, which were held at various juvenile justice facilities. And essentially, the intent of the focus group was to inform the research by collecting information directly from youth who have experienced or who are experiencing mental health concerns. And we gained a lot of very useful information from the focus groups, including youth-perceived barriers in obtaining treatment, as well as resources that are lacking in their communities, and even methods to aid in the creation of new resources. In addition to that research, I also volunteer at a local nonprofit organization called Communities for Recovery, which brings recovery programs to drug and alcohol rehabilitation programs. As a peer support volunteer, I act as a mentor as well as a facilitator of these recovery programs. Also, I will be working with Dr. Holleran and Steiker on the dialogue project at Westlake High School and Westlake Alternative Schools. And all of this experience has given me some insight into the lives of recovering individuals. And if there's one thing that I've learned from it all, it's that as a recovering youth, community and peer support is absolutely vital to your recovery. So I hope that by all of us being here, it is made aware that as undergraduates, you can become involved in research that you're passionate about, and you're at an amazing place to do that. University of Texas has many, many opportunities, so please get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. And how interesting to go to the young people themselves instead of doing it all in the ivory tower. And there's another model for research. Kate actually does research by talking to groups of young people. And that's another way you can do it. Now we have a student panel here. They have questions. We're going to have time for them to ask one question each. And rather than introduce the whole panel at once, I thought I would introduce each one of you and ask you to ask your question, and we'll deal with that question, and then I'll go on to the next one. So let me start with Danny Zeng, who is a sophomore in international, wait, Danny Zeng is a junior in government and finance.
Okay, it's working. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. I thought that was a fascinating talk by all of you. It's truly amazing what great university we attend to have the opportunity to hear things like drug abuse research and then neuroscience and things about the brain. But I'm a junior. I'll stand up.
Yeah.
I'm a junior in the government department as well as Macomb School of Business with the finance department. So I do have a question for Dr. Elkins and John over there. Talking about the Constitution, of course, I think my question as a student in government would be, how would you define a good Constitution? You know, what distinguishes a good Constitution from, say, a bad Constitution?
Yeah. Well,
John, do you want
to take that?
You can take that.
Well, I really love this binary choice between good and bad Constitution, because often that really is the way, in some ways, the mass public sees them. And there are a variety of metrics by which one could actually evaluate them. I think one is certainly about stability. I mean, a Constitution would seem to be working if it sticks around and continues to govern people's activities. And a second part of that has to do with whether it's actually governing what's going on the ground, whether there's actual compliance. And I was getting to this a little bit in the talk, but when you think about constitutions, one of the ways they're like marriage is that there's no external guarantor who's there to enforce these things. These people have come together to live with each other in perpetuity, but if, say, the executive were to transgress the bounds of the Constitution, it's not as if sort of the 9 wise, elderly, robed people are going to stand in the way of the president from transgressing. I mean, let's face it. And so whether or not the rules on the books actually conform to what goes on in society is another great measure of whether a constitution is good or not. I'm going to give you a third, because it's such a great question. A third measure of whether it's, I think, a good constitution is whether the mass public can understand it. There are a lot of contracts out there that are written really for people not to understand. Let's take, a credit card contract. How many people read a credit contract before signing up? All right, you're just messing with me. But they befuddle us, right, for the most part, and they're really long. The constitutions are one thing that the mass public are actually supposed to read and understand. And theoretically, the way executives and other leaders are actually held to account is by the mass public, who will actually coordinate and stand up together and prevent the executive from doing something that transgresses the Constitution. So actually having something that's interpretable and clear, like any good writing, is another. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good question, good answer. Michael Williams is a senior in sociology and works in youth and community studies. So I think it's pretty obvious what kind of question he might ask.
Yes, this is for the social work group. Once again, fourth year sociology and education, youth and community studies. Now this is for you. In your research, you use the word adolescent. I actually would like you to define the word, because some of us may assume that it actually means teenager. That ranges from the word, like year of 13 years to 18. But also, you could also include college students that are below the age of 21. Absolutely. So I wanted you to define that.
Well, we're now using the term adolescents and emerging adults to make the differentiation between younger adolescents and older adolescents, because I think that those of us that work in the field of addiction often joke that adolescence, if you define it by behavior and judgment, can go well into the 30s and 40s. What we usually do is talk about younger adolescents being, of course, and now drug use typically has moved younger and younger, so we often can include 12 and 13-year-olds in the early adolescence group, and then, of course, the regular adolescents. And collegiate recovery is a huge movement these days. There's a lot of research, budding research about recovery communities, and so I'm glad you brought that up. That I use the term very loosely in my talk today, but you're absolutely right that we have to be clear about such things.
Thank you. Another good question, a good answer. Geetika Jareth is a sophomore in International Relations and Global Studies.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Elkins. I want to know, since countries have different constitutions and different viewpoints on aspects such as free speech, for example, has that led them into international conflicts?
Interesting. Well, I don't specialize in conflict, but I think it is actually quite true that often the sources of conflict among countries has to do with different worldviews. I think it's safe to say that the Cold War was largely about that. And if you look at the constitutions of the two aligned countries in that sort of polar battle, you see two very different worldviews in their constitutions. You see many social and economic rights inscribed into sort of the Soviet constitutions and their satellites, and then a very different set of rights, civil and political rights, mainly in sort of the US aligned countries. And so it's kind of interesting you see that. For the most part, however, you don't see huge differences among countries with respect to those sorts of things, which is strange. And in part of that reason, I think, is that the idea of democracy has become so globalized, and even countries who are really on the authoritarian governments, let's face it, still put up these Potemkin-like democratic facades with very democratic-like constitutions. And so to the extent that there are different worldviews, sometimes you don't see it in the Constitution.
Thank you. Divya Ramamurthy is a freshman in biomedical engineering and Plan 2.
My question is actually for Dr. Dominguez. And I was wondering about determinism. And so how and where do you draw the line between human behavior that's shaped by the environment and people around you, or human behavior that's shaped by chemical cues like you were talking about?
That's a very good question. You want to comment on that? Feel free to. Well, it's interesting that you're asking that, because Professor Woodruff and I have interacted before, Professor Woodruff being in the philosophy department, and I in fact have guest lectured in his class. And my view is probably, and you're asking for my opinion because there's no right answer to this question, my view is probably unlike most, and that is that I do genuinely believe that our biology is the driving force behind all of our behaviors. Do we have the technology to be able to measure and determine whether that is the case? The answer to that is no. I suspect that the time will come, likely no time soon, when we will have the technology that allows us to determine with little uncertainty that our behaviors are dependent entirely on mechanisms of neurology.
Well, let me follow that up a little bit, using my prerogative here as chair. If our behaviors are determined by biological factors, isn't Professor Holleran Steiker wasting her time going to the schools?
Not at all. In fact, our brain is very plastic, and so, but it's still biological. Yes. And so we respond to our environment. One of the evolutionary theories as to why children are so susceptible to their environment is so that they could be molded, right? And so this mold and this plasticity never ends. In fact, our brain is constantly changing throughout our lives. It just happens that early in life it's much more malleable, much more responsive to the environment. But later in life, as adults, we're still responding to the environment, and our brain is still changing. And so no, not at all. I think that the sort of treatment that was being described is helpful, but it's helpful because it is galvanizing changes in the brain. So still biological.
I would agree with that. Can I add one thing?
Yeah.
When Dr. Erickson from pharmacy speaks in our class, he loves to tell people that it is absolutely a fact that talk therapy heals the brain, that there are determinable changes in the brain for recovering addicts and alcoholics due to the work that they do with each other, the work that they do in 12-step programs, and the work that they do in therapeutic environments. So I would agree.
Does this mean that if I teach an effective class and the students learn something, that I have changed their brains?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I like to tell the story of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, because he's known for the saying, and I'm paraphrasing now, a mind once changed never returns to its original dimensions. And I remember as a graduate student sitting in a room studying and learning about learning, or learning about memory, learning about learning and memory. And I saw this on the poster, and it struck me because Justice Holmes could not at the time have known what we know today, which goes to the original question, which is that there are many things that we may still not be able to understand because we just can't study them. And so you're absolutely right. When my final exam in my class, I ended with the phrase, I hope that your brain is different now than it was when you came into this class because of what you've learned in this class, and that's absolutely true. So it's a very malleable system. We're constantly learning, but it's all biological. It's not in the black box.
Can I say something? This just goes back to the picture that I'm sure everybody saw. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs, right? Going back to 6th grade, I'm sure, for everybody, no?
So,
maybe it's a generational thing, I don't know.
This is your brain in a philosophy class. Okay. So, the honor of the last question goes to Joe Ramos.
Thank you. Hi, my question's for Dr. Holleran Steiker. It's awesome hearing the interlay between your different disciplines and how they're all related to one another. And as a freshman who's beginning to enter into the research realm, especially the empirical sciences, I guess the only form of publicizing research that I've come across is writing. Now, as someone who isn't necessarily in the empirical sciences, what modes do you have of implementing your findings?
Yeah, well, it's so interesting that you asked that. I was so heartbroken the first time that I presented my research as a social worker in a multidisciplinary setting, and somebody said, social workers do research? You know, I mean, it dismays me, but we have a Society for Social Work and Research, and we do have NIH grants funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and so our publications and our journals are have high impact factors, but there's a lot of crossover with psychology and sociology, I would say. So my dissemination is primarily through publications in terms of articles, peer-reviewed articles, presentations at conferences, reports from grants. And I would also say that I take it on as a personal responsibility as part of my service. As professors, we do teaching and research and service. I disseminate by making sure that I go to the local schools and make sure that they know the findings of my research, that I present at community forums the findings of my research. So I'm not shy, as you can tell, about disseminating in any venue that I can find the opportunity. I think now with web-based opportunities to disseminate, those are also magnificent opportunities for getting the word out, especially for controversial interventions like non-abstinence-based interventions and harm reduction interventions. I think we need to be having these dialogues with other researchers. It's important. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you for wonderful questions. Now, modern brain research has given us some interesting results about teaching. I've been told that measurable brain activity during a typical university lecture is roughly at the same level as it is for someone who is asleep or daydreaming about sex. Brain activity for somebody who's engaged in research is very high. Your likelihood of changing for the better, for the smarter, to be a more effective person, your likelihood of changing is a whole lot greater if you get involved in research than if you spend your college career sitting in lectures by people like me. Be aware of the possibilities. You can work in a lab like Tricia. You can work with adolescents or emerging adults like Kate. Or like John, you can work at a computer and make possible new kinds of constitutional comparison through these tools he's developing. And there are many other things besides these that you can find out about in areas you're interested in. So I want to thank the speakers and the student panelists and all of you for being here.